Welcome to the Grow Podcast. I'm Pastor Mike with New Hope Network. We're here to help you take your next step in your relationship with Jesus. I'm so glad you're with us today.
What's up, New Hope family? Welcome to the Grow Podcast, episode 95. My name is David.
95.
Glad that you're here. With me, as always, is Pastor Mike. Hello, Pastor Mike.
Hello, David.
95 episodes of this.
Every time, these high numbers, I just can't believe we've
lot.
done that many. Yeah.
So we'd be getting close to we've been doing this for almost 2 years.
Crazy.
I was
waiting for you to say, we're getting close to 100. I'm like, 95 would be close to 100.
Well, yeah.
Your
And
sense
close
of
to
the
2
obvious
years.
is pretty amazing. Yeah.
We also, we're right around I've worked here for 3 years now. I don't remember. I have no idea when I started, but I know it was right before Easter, I believe. Or right after Easter. I don't know.
2020.
It was 2020. I know I accepted the job in March, but I don't remember. Or no, it must have been April, because it was after Matilda was born.
Okay.
I don't know. I don't remember. It's been a long time. I can't even remember. It's been
Seems
so
like
long
forever
now.
having you around.
But then we've been doing this for 2 years,
Yeah.
almost 2 years.
Yeah.
That's pretty great. And all of you have been listening for some amount of time, less than 2 years. Some of you have been listening the whole time. What do you have to say to those people who've listened to 95 straight episodes of the Grow Podcast?
I want to say I'm sorry you've had to put up with us that long, but thank you. Because we always start out with some nonsense, and we never really know where we're going to go at first. We know where the teaching plan is, but at first
that part is planned
it's just
out.
absolutely random, and it's always amusing to find out and hear where we go.
Where's it going to go today?
I have no
You're looking
idea.
at me because you
I have no
usually
idea.
expect me to lead the you lead the non-nonsense and I lead the nonsense, which I think that's a good role for the both of us. If you had
works.
Let's say episode 96, I can't be here, and you need someone to replace me. Ignore the. Do you think they're would be good on a podcast thing? Just the who would lead you best into the nonsense part on staff.
On staff,
You just needed the nonsense. Here. How about this? I'll be here 8 minutes
It's
into
easy.
the episode.
Olivia.
But Olivia would be your
Yeah.
choice.
Yeah.
Boy.
If just pure nonsense, she's going to take me into the nonsense.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good choice. That would be a really interesting. Maybe for episode 96, we should have Olivia do the first 7 minutes of the podcast. And
She's great on the lobby. Let's
just see where that goes. I think that's whatever. Michael's in the room who was with us. Whatever episode that was, where Hattie and Olivia were both on the lobby, and it was our most ridiculous episode ever. Go watch that one and you see what would happen.
Of course, if you haven't listened to us before, last week, coming out of Easter, we spent, I don't know how much time talking about jelly beans.
Right. But anybody that's watching this knows you reasonably well. So you talking about jelly beans, I'm surprised that we got to anything else other than jelly beans.
This is true.
I think either sports, like if we started talking about like baseball history, or just history in general. Mm-hmm. That's what would derail me the most. If you want us to get to talking about Paul like we planned on, and we promised last week, we should probably avoid the Twins, who I'm very upset with right now because we have really good starting pitching, but we won't let any of them pitch more than like 5 innings.
But they're a Minnesota team. You should used to being disappointed.
But that's the whole bit with being a Minnesota sports fan is they're going to let you down. But every year you're like,
but you
maybe this year they won't let me down. And then it happens and it hurts just as much every time.
Exercise in futile faith.
What they're the best at, they're kind of like a cult leader. Like they hurt you.
Where are we going now?
They hurt you, but then they do just enough to bring you back in. They're like, no. And it's a hard relationship to be in as a Minnesota sports fan.
The definition of abuse?
It is, but I'm telling you, 10 times a year, I text a friend of mine who's also like a Twins fan, or this happens with the Vikings too, and I'm like, I'm done. I'm done caring about this team. I'm not going to watch any more games. Yeah. And then they rattle off like an 8-game winning streak, and you're like, wait a minute.
Maybe this is it. Maybe I gave up too soon.
Done it. And then you come back and they like blow a 9-run lead in the 8th inning, and you're like, this is why. This is why my dad doesn't watch Vikings games anymore.
I had a car like that once where it's like, I'm going to give up. And then like for a week, it would be great. I'm like, you know what? I can get another few miles out. And then it would,
Yeah, that's Minnesota sport. I feel like probably less than half of the people that are watching are Minnesota fans because of where we're located. We're far enough away where not everybody. Minnesota has most of the fans here, but not all of them. And then so many people that connect with us aren't from this area.
And
anyway.
Williston is such a diverse town from all over the world. So.
Yeah, so not everybody knows our pain and our suffering, and that I've passed on to my child. Poor
and I
kid.
haven't lived in Minnesota since 1979, so I've been removed a long time, and I'm still. I wouldn't call. I mean, I'm not your level of fan because I'm not a high-end sports person, but I would like to cheer them on in a winning time sometime.
Can we change my job title on the church website to high-end sports person? Because that sounds great. I was a friend of mine has just accepted a job at a new church where he's going to be doing tech stuff and production stuff. But they have a sports ministry pastor on staff, and that's just a dream job.
That would be.
One of these days.
I track no sports team or anything that may disappoint some people. I remember it. So the church that we helped plant.
You love making Vikings jokes. In your sermons,
love making fun of them because they're so easy to make fun of, and everybody understands. But one of my best friends who planted the church, we planted the church together. He started it, about a year or so. And was the lead pastor. He knew I didn't track any sports team, but he also knew that I like to have conversations with people. So almost every day he would come into the office and give me here's a 2-minute summary of everything that happened in the sports world yesterday to give me enough so I could carry on a conversation.
Perfect.
That's a good friend. That's a great friend
that's
right
a good
there.
friend. He's your 2-minute Sports Center update.
Yep.
That's good.
It's just give me the Cliff Notes. I'm good.
Well, I'm certain that Paul would have been a Minnesota sports fan because I grew up right outside.
He went through a lot of agony and pain in his life.
He wouldn't have even noticed. Yeah. I grew up right outside of St. Paul, Minnesota.
Oh, so I see the connection you
what I
made
did
there.
Yeah. That's good. But last week we started talking about the beginning of the church and what the church should look like according to the Bible, not just according to Pastor Mike, but according to the Bible. And now we've started talking about Paul. Which, by the way, if you've missed any of the weekend teachings, we really encourage you to go check them out on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/New Hope Here. You can find all of them. You can go to our website or on the app, find them all there too. So hopefully you know that by now if you've been joining us for a while. If you're new to the Grow podcast, we're so glad that you're here. But pause if you've missed the weekend teaching because this is like a supplement to that to go a little bit deeper. But started looking at Paul. We're going to touch on every aspect of his life because there's so little.
Yes, we're spending 2 weekends on it and 2 Grow podcasts on it. And he wrote, 30% of the words in the New Testament, like 2/3 of the books in the New Testament are written by him. Almost the entire second half of the book of Acts, the early history of the church, is almost specifically about Paul.
Is he the most important person in the New Testament not named Jesus? Maybe not blood related to
He
Jesus.
would be the most famous,
For sure,
and definitely in the early church, the greatest missionary and so impactful. And we'll look in both this last weekend's teaching and next weekend's teaching. I give some statistics for those that want that. And we'll give a little bit of it today. But you just look at the accomplishments of his life, and it's just amazing.
I have a question about missionaries that I don't know when I'm going to sprinkle in. Do you want me to just start with it before we dive into Paul, or should I throw it in at some point?
Sure, why not?
Okay. So the bulk of the you talked about how much of the New Testament Paul wrote. He was the most famous missionary. But I feel like even when I was growing up, we would hear about missionaries so much. They were such important figures in the church. We would study these missionaries that went to Africa. The Spear movie. What was that called? About the missionaries that went to South America and were killed, and then their wives went and still shared Jesus with that same tribe. Anyway, missionaries, I feel like were such a focus. And I feel like now, and I don't know if it's because the celebrity aspect of large churches and their pastors have seemingly taken over, but when you think of like major people in the faith, it's never a missionary anymore. Ever. It's this big pastor or that big pastor or, that speaker over there or whatever. It's almost never is it like, how many missionaries can you name that, we don't have like a relationship with from our church or whatever. Why do you think that happened when clearly when we look at the early church, Paul was a missionary, but he was, this huge important person, this famous person wrote so much of our. Anyway, that just came to mind as I was reading over your notes for the podcast. It's a valid question,
and one I haven't given a ton of thought to. So
I didn't want
I
for
just
this
give
question at all.
some first impressions, and I would be interested if there's somebody who's done some study into it. I think some of it is the modernization of the world.
Sure.
Even in the third world countries, I mean, there's some pretty remote stuff, but this communication thing that, we can be anywhere in the world and not be out of touch now.
Right.
Like our missionaries who we used to not hear from for months at a time. Now, I like a lot of missionaries that we support at New Hope. I text and write them almost every day.
Sure.
So it's just instant. So we aren't as out of touch. So there's not as much isolation, and then you have modernization. It used to be you're giving up so much, and I think that's some of the second thing is in the church, and I think this is somewhat of a tragedy, although it went too far. We don't talk about the sacrifice of sharing the gospel to a lost world in the way that we probably need to. We almost approach it if it costs me, then maybe something's wrong, not realizing that goes hand in hand.
Yeah.
I don't remember who it was that said it. So if someone's listened, then they could even Google it. But someone said it. I won't get it exactly right. But one of the greatest ways to inhibit the work of the church is make it easy to be a Christian. Because then you begin to take things for granted, and your faith isn't stretched. Because it's like with a plant or a tree, you need some wind, you need some storm to send the roots down deep. And I think that some of it is we've lived for the last several decades, in a much easier world, at least in the Western world.
Right.
Not in every part of the world. It's my theory. I don't know if all that's true.
Yeah. Well, you talked on the weekend about how Paul had kind of been uniquely prepared for being this, this big, great missionary in the early church. So can you give us can we go into a little more detail on that?
Yeah, we can go into a little bit more detail. His education, I touched on it over the weekend, but he was a student of a guy by the name of Gamaliel, who...
Sounds like a Lord of the Rings character, by the way. It does.
Actually, it reminds me of, what was the character in Smurfs?
I don't know. Our producer knows, though.
Was that Smurfs? Gargamel? Yeah.
I'm not up to date on my Smurfs knowledge.
Takes me back to my middle school years.
Michael knew immediately.
Yeah, that's what it was. But he was one of the premier teachers, and not just knew a lot, but he was one of the most famous teachers. So you could only become a student of his if you were someone, really kind of three conditions: someone extremely smart that showed some promise, or if you had wealth, your family had wealth, or political connections. So it was a little bit like an Ivy League education.
Sure. Yeah, he was the Harvard of his time.
And it was considered a high-end education. So he had this high-end education, which he would need to teach and speak to the highest intellectuals and people in leadership, but he could also speak to the lowest of the low. And because of that, because of his economics, he was born into a Roman citizenship, which we kind of think of, you're born into a country, you're automatically a citizen. That's not the way it worked in the Roman Empire. It was a very clear class society, and a Roman citizen had rights and abilities and accessibility that no one else had. So he was able to travel more. He was able to travel more inexpensively there, and much more safety, and had access to some things. So he was born in Tarsus, which was a major city in the Roman province, kind of Syria, where we look at it today. And then as a Jew, he was part of the Pharisees, which was we've talked a little bit about the Pharisees, Sadducees, two different groups. The Pharisees, and his father was a Pharisee as well. So they were the difference with Pharisees, they were strict observers of the Jewish oral law. And this is really where he came in conflict with the Christians.
Yep.
Because the oral law had very little to do with the law of Moses. Now, they believed in the law of Moses, but the Pharisees had added to it and interpreted it and questioned it so much. They had their own set of laws that were not anywhere written in the Old Testament scriptures, from the Old Testament prophets or the Mosaic law. And so they had taken this oral law, and that's where, when Jesus came along and he contradicted a lot of it, And then when the followers of Jesus and the early church began teaching about following the one true God, Yahweh, but they didn't follow all of this tradition and law, he's like, all right, you people need to be done away with. But that also, when you look at how it prepared him, he was able to tackle that once he had an encounter with Jesus, because he was able to speak the language. I mean, not just the literal language, although he was fluent in at least Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic. We know he was fluent in all three of those. But he could speak the law of religion, both in Judaism and in a Greco-Roman world, the whole world of idolatry and things. So he could think like and relate to people and to people wherever they were. So he was amazing that way. Yeah. Probably wasn't the first believer in his family. I don't know if you ever thought about that before. When you look at after he became a Christian, he went to Tarsus because he felt safe there, because he was kind of threatened by the Jewish people who had empowered him to kill people, and now he became one of the people he had been empowered to kill. Probably because he had family there. And remember, his dad was a Pharisee. So the only reason he would go to family there is why? Is because if they were family who were at least somewhat close to or okay with Christianity. And we actually find out later in his writings, there are some fellow missionaries, church leaders, Andronicus, and Junia were Christians before he was. We find out their family for him. He mentions Herodian, who was another relative who was in Rome with those two much later on. And those are things that they don't matter much, but you just kind of go, okay, there's a lot of connection here. Sure. So he wasn't necessarily the first Christian in his family, but definitely the most famous.
Yeah. So he spent, how many years was he?
About 30 years of his life sailing around the Mediterranean basin in the Roman
missionary
Empire.
Trips and going to a lot of the major cities at the time.
Yeah.
Some of which the books of the Bible are named after. So can you kind of summarize those missionary trips for us here?
So the book of Acts records 3 trips. History tells us there probably was a 4th, which we'll talk about in a minute. His first trip was when he first was sent out by the church. They empowered him to, obviously God wants more than just Jewish people to know. So go tell the rest of the Roman Empire. So it was probably the shortest travel.
You say obviously, but it wasn't
it wasn't to them.
It wasn't automatically obvious for them, which is
they wrestled with this. In fact, after his first trip, he had to kind of come back, and there was this big almost split in the church, and he had to say, "Listen, it's Jesus is changing these people's lives. This is for real." So he went on a boat to the island of Cyprus and then traveled around kind of what we would call Turkey. And then, so there's 2 Antiochs. When you read he was sent from Antioch, there's one kind of in the Israel region. And these were both named after Roman names. And then there was another Antioch, actually a bigger Antioch, up in what we would call modern-day Turkey. So he started in one. He ended up in the other one.
Very confusing, Pastor.
It is kind of confusing. But you kind of read that and you go, where is he right now?
Yep.
And he hit both of those. So then later, and we can talk about some of the years later, he started another trip, and this time he went by road up into Turkey instead of taking a boat up into Turkey, and went across kind of modern-day Turkey, and then Philippi, which is kind of, so Greece, if you look at a modern-day map, Greece is kind of that peninsula that goes down in, but it also kind of goes up on the mainland. Philippi was kind of up in there. He went down the coast of Greece to Athens, and then across the peninsula to Corinth, which is there, and then he went back to the west coast of Turkey and Ephesus, which was a major one, and then back to Israel. Trip number 3 was very similar to the second trip, except he went back and revisited some people he visited on the first trip, and eventually got to Greece and then home. Those are his 3 major missionary trips. We find out later he was arrested and accused of all kinds of things. And they were accusing him of things that he wasn't sure he would be able to get on top of out of in the Jewish judicial system. So that's why he appealed to Caesar, because as a Roman citizen he could. So he was sent to Rome, put in jail in Rome under house arrest. And we know he eventually was martyred, beheaded in Rome. But some tradition in history believes he was released from that house arrest for a while. And that's where he went on a 4th trip, not recorded in Scripture, most likely to the far reaches of the Roman Empire, Spain, because there's some archaeological evidence of that. but then eventually came back to Rome and was so famous, so prominent that this Caesar, this emperor called Nero, who hated the Christian church, decided, we're going to do away with this.
Yeah.
And tradition, and I believe it's probably true, tells us that he was beheaded there, and there is a hill where they used a lot for their executions. That actually right now is where the Vatican is, and that's kind of the tradition that's probably where he was executed.
Travel was notoriously easy in these times. Quick.
Yeah.
Just a quick jaunt across the Roman Empire. I mean, technically it was easier than it had been before the Roman Empire, but we just talked about trip 1 and he goes to Cyprus and he goes from Antioch to Antioch, but how long is that?
That was about 4 years.
That's 4
from
years.
45, 40, because he would stay in some place for months at a time.
Sure.
Trip number 2 is about 3 years.
Okay.
A little bit shorter. Excuse me. Trip number 3 was probably about 5 years. That was a much longer trip. See, because he stayed in some places for some period of time. And in each of these places, remember, he was put in jail in some of these places. So he had to sit in jail sometimes for weeks or months at a time. And that's where we get some of these letters where he's saying, bring me a jacket, bring me a sweater, because it's cold in this jail.
Yeah. What would he do in the time between?
Most of the time he was back in Antioch, or it was kind of Israel. So he would hang out with some of the other disciples. He would hang out in kind of his home church in that area. I'm sure he did some study because he definitely was a scholar and would visit some. I would venture to guess he wouldn't be surprised if he went some of the ancient libraries to go, okay, I had this encounter with these philosophers and I want to understand more so I can have a deeper conversation with them.
A lot of the New Testament, as you already mentioned, he wrote a lot of it, and it was much of it. All of that was written during these travels. Most of it was written during these travels.
During his travels, some of it was written in prison.
Can you talk to us about what was written when?
Yeah,
and
so they're kind of divided into 2 groups. So his letters to the churches during his travels, and then what's called his prison epistles, which were most likely written when he was in prison in Rome.
Okay.
And not all, but most likely in Rome, because he had more time on his hands. And you can read it in there, like some of them, like we just talked about, where he's like, please come visit me in prison. I'm discouraged. Bring me a blanket, bring me a sweater, bring me something. He didn't write any on his first mission trip because he was just starting churches. But after his first mission trip, he wrote Galatians, we believe, was the first book that he actually wrote.
Okay.
And that was to a group of churches in a region called Galatia that he had visited with some of them. Some have been planted out of some of the places he wrote. So it's somewhere between his first and second trip. 1st, 2nd Thessalonians. So it's kind of unclear whether 1st, 2nd Thessalonians or Galatians was the first.
Okay.
But 1st, 2nd Thessalonians are 2 letters, 2 different letters, written in sequence that he wrote sometime during his second trip. So somewhere around 50 to 51 AD. And, we talked a few weeks ago about the importance of recognizing how soon after the events of Jesus that these things were written down. So think about it. If Jesus was born somewhere around 3-4 BC and was crucified somewhere in his early 30s, probably 30, 33. So we're in about 30 AD when the crucifixion and the resurrection happened. Somewhere around there, Pentecost happened. So within 20 years, we have these writings. Not enough time for things to be exaggerated, or they could have been exaggerated, but we'd also have other writings of people going, yeah, that's not the way it happened.
Right.
And there are none. There's none that way. Trip number 3, he wrote 1st, 2nd Corinthians because, the Corinthian church is probably the most messed up church in that age.
Congrats to them. What a fun
and you
way
look
to
at where they were. I mean, it's such a messed up. They were like the Las Vegas on steroids of the day, and so it's like he had a lot of correcting to do there.
It's almost impressive to stand out from that time of the Hellenistic world. to be that much worse than it. Like it's
Oh, yeah.
you had to work to get that done.
And the stuff that they just considered to be normal, like there was a leader who was, having an affair with someone, and everybody knew about it. It's like, well, we'll just let that go. And he's like, no, that's not okay. We
Yeah.
need to call out sin in a loving way. And then when this person repents, and this is where the second Corinthians comes in, they all go, yeah, you sinned. We aren't letting you back in, which we still do some of that today.
Definitely.
It's like, no, that's not how this works, you know.
Yeah.
So we get just some great church teaching, and some of the best teaching about how the church should operate comes from Paul addressing messes in the church,
Yeah.
The book of Romans, probably my top two favorites of Paul's writings, because Romans is just so amazingly complete. Where I think, I want to say maybe next week we're going to talk about Romans a little bit, and go deeper into it. That was written somewhere in Trip 3, and then we come into kind of the prison letters.
What's your second?
Colossians.
Okay.
I love Colossians, and it's just part of it's because it just means a lot to me. That's where my life
Sure.
verse is from, and there's just some depth of
Yeah.
things in there. So during this time in 57 to 60 AD, you get Ephesians and Colossians, Philemon or Philemon. You get the letter to the Laodicean church, which we don't have, but is referred to in the New Testament. So we know it existed. In fact, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, it was probably written to that same group of people. Philippians, one of his most famous letters written from jail. And then we kind of get these pastoral letters. Most were written from prison, or maybe even on his fourth journey. So 1 Timothy, written to Timothy, who was the pastor of Ephesus at the time, kind of the largest, almost the megachurch of the time. Somewhere in there, we think around 63, 64 AD, he might have been released from Rome, and then he wrote 2 Timothy and Titus, and around 67 AD was when he would have been executed in there. So you have this whole group. Some people attribute Hebrews to Paul. All of his other letters have his name on them. And he says, hey, it's me,
Yep.
And he'll even say, like some of them where it was obvious, where people say, hey, was this really you? Because it's obvious someone else wrote it, especially as he got older. He would say, no, look at the last. And at the end, I signed it with my manuscripts. Hebrews has nothing like that. It doesn't tell us who wrote it.
Yeah.
It's in very similar style like to Romans, but it's enough different. It's like, is it or not? A lot of scholars believe it was probably someone discipled by Paul or by someone.
Thus the similarities in some ways of the style.
My personal belief, and this isn't something I would die for, but just because I kind of like it, I think it was Apollos, who you read about, one of the early evangelists and big teachers of the church, and you read about how intellectual he was and some of those things, and I just think that could be because he was discipled and schooled by some of Paul's people that Paul had mentored, so it could very easily be that.
Were the letters like immediately spread? So he writes the first letter to the Thessalonians, and did they immediately go share that letter with the Corinthian church and the church in Ephesus? Because you even said he refers in a letter to his letter to the Laodiceans as if like I know I know that exists. Yeah. But if so do we?
There's a couple of the letters where he actually says, "Hey, make sure you share this with."
Sure.
That. We don't. There's some evidence where it's very clear some years later that they started circulating. We don't know exactly when, but it would not have been uncommon in that day and age. Sure. I mean, the Greek culture, much before the Roman culture, kind of emphasized this. That's part of why the timing of this and God's timing is so amazing. He used the Greek culture to begin to set up the philosophy and how they operate. So for writings to be circulated and teaching to be circulated would have been very normal. Sure. Yeah. So it would have been very normal for someone to go, hey, you know what, let's copy this and when you go over to Galatia, I'm going to send this letter because they might enjoy and they might benefit from some of this teaching, even though it was for us.
Yeah. Okay, so that was a lot of stuff. Do I have to know all of that stuff in order to properly read these?
It's helpful, but even there's some of this I had to go and look up, and I've been living with this stuff on a kind of an academic for years. Yeah. That's why it's important to have a good Bible.
Right.
That's why we've talked about also the website with the overarching timeline. It has, I think it's Bible Timeline. It has all of this on there, but it's just good to kind of know when these. And kind of the point of today is to get an idea that these were written very close to these events. These were not written by someone some years later. These are written by a person named Paul, not a perfect person, in response to actual events. But God inspired them so that in response to these actual events, they also inform and teach us and help us grow in our events 2,000 years later. So we kind of go, it gives a lot of meaning when Paul is writing on gratitude from prison. Sure. That's Philippians. Gives a lot of meaning when Paul is writing to Timothy, who traveled with him for years, and just describes his care for him and don't give up, don't be discouraged. You begin to go into this. It gives a lot of meaning when you realize Paul lived in Corinth, in this kind of Las Vegas for years. He knew what was happening, so you get a feeling of this, and you kind of know where this was.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Pastor Mike. We have more to talk about, which we will get into next week. Like you said, we're going to go deeper into Romans next week, and I think Galatians.
We're going to look into Romans and Galatians more deeply, those two, because they're kind of twin books.
Yep.
And then we'll real quickly go over every other letter in the New Testament except Revelation, so you can kind of see here's the overarching theme in general, so you can maybe write it in your Bible or have it.
Awesome. Well, that'll be a great one. Make sure that you join us next week. We're so glad that you were here. As we always say, growth always starts with the next step. So it's always a great next step to check out the Grow podcast. But again, as always, make sure that we're not just listening to these things and then they don't affect our lives or our decision making or anything like that in any way. Let's make sure that we're putting the things that we're learning into practice as we read through the Bible in 30 weeks. 31 weeks. 30 weeks. What did we settle on? 30 weeks.
30 weeks.
30 weeks. So, and we're almost done. I can't believe it.
2 more weeks.
2 more weeks. So make sure you're joining us on the weekends as well at one of our campuses, whether you're in Williston or in Tioga or New Hope here, our online campus. We hope to see you for the weekends. That's all I got. We love you guys. We will see you next time.